Just to give you a heads up, in today's episode, one of our guests mentions something that's more suited for a mature audience. We don't go into any detail at all, but we want you to be aware in case you're listening with young children or more sensitive listeners nearby. Welcome to 78.4, the podcast that helps you leave a godly legacy for future generations by showing you incredible things God has done in the lives of men and women around the world. If he can do those things in these people's lives, imagine what he can do in yours. I'm Bob.
And I'm Matt. So, Bob, what does 78.4 mean? Because this being our first episode, and those are just numbers, we don't want to sound cryptic. What exactly is just 78.4?
78.4 comes from Psalm 78.4. It's kind of our guiding principle for the podcast. And it talks about telling future generations what God has done. Well, what we want to do here is we want to give folks an opportunity to see what God is doing in the lives of very normal people. And as you're doing that, we want you to think, if God can do that in this person's life, what can he do in mine?
Right. And today we're going to start with the theme of freedom.
Right.
Pretty much asking the question, what does it mean to be free? We talk about freedom. Throughout all history, humanity has tried to grasp freedom.
Give me liberty or give me death.
George Wallace and not George Wallace. That's a comedian. William Wallace.
Big difference.
In Braveheart. Imagine George Wallace in Braveheart with all the... That'd be awesome. William Wallace and Braveheart, it makes me think about that scene at the end where his guts are being yanked out of him and he musters up the courage to just yell one word before he dies, and that word is...
Freedom.
Freedom, yeah. So that's what we want to talk about today. So today we're going to hear from three people who have their own takes on what it is to be free.
Okay, and our first story is from a guy named Ward Coleman. Ward has been working with the Josh McDowell ministry for, at least 30 years. Back in the 90s, the Josh McDowell ministry started taking humanitarian aid into the former Soviet Union, and Ward had gone into Butyrka prison. Now, Butyrka, according to Radio Free Europe, is the place that they send you to break you.
The Ivan Drago.
The what?
Ivan Drago place. I will break you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Rocky IV, of
course. And so we're in Moscow. It's at least 20 below zero.
Below.
It is bitterly, bitterly cold. Ward had gone in to bring in whatever aid he could, and he and a bunch of volunteers. And this is his story.
On Tuesday, we went to the prison, Butyrka. It was built 300 years ago. There are 6,500 prisoners there. We walked in, and it was literally like the dungeons pictured on so many movies I've seen. The prisoners there receive very little, either to eat or to wear. We came up to cell number 16. Dmitri walked up with the key and turned it, and there's a little door about 6 by 8 inches that drops down on a steel door. And immediately, eyes are looking out. The face I saw really stunned me, because this was a face of a man who was calm, who was peaceful, who was satisfied, and a smile played on his face. I thought, how in the world could he smile? I found out that 4 years ago, Victor had been arrested for a crime. Never convicted yet, but arrested. Since then, he's come to Christ. He's become an artist. And during that time now, whenever he reads Scripture, he will draw a picture of whatever that Scripture passage is. But he gave us some pictures. And then he went back to his wall, brought down a beautiful crucifix, and brought it to the window and shared, this was a crucifix. He says, give it to Mr. McDowell. I've read his books. They have helped me so immensely here in prison. And then we asked, well, what is this made with? And he said, this is made out of bread. I chose to make this crucifix rather than to eat the bread the day that it came. found out that the only way he could get those colors was to either take the brown from his coffee cup or find the red in something else that was in his cell, the greens in something else. So literally, there was Jesus, the bread of life, on this crucifix. It is an amazing artwork. One of the statements that Victor made really stopped me right in my tracks. Looking through this small window, he said, "I'm happier now than I've ever been in my life. Before I had a large flat, I had money, I knew influential people. But now I have Jesus Christ." And I looked in there and I thought, Victor, I would like to be in there where you are, because I sense there's more freedom there than there is out here.
I love that story.
No, me too. What's crazy to me is when people think about freedom, usually they're thinking about physical freedom, being oppressed, which is true. That is a true freedom. But this guy has the audacity to say that spiritual freedom makes it so that it doesn't even matter where you are, what situation you're in, and you can still be free. That seems to be a paradox, and yet that's exactly what he experienced. And I thought that was pretty cool. The next person we're going to hear from on freedom is Tyrone Tompkins.
Yes.
Now, Tyrone is the leader of the Cru High School ministry now, but he grew up in a broken home, abuse. He even lived in his car for a little while, and he came out on the other side. So here is what Tyrone said when we asked what freedom means to him.
Wow. So what does freedom mean to me? It's interesting, that question, because a few weeks ago I was talking with my daughter, and we had recently taken her to the Equal Justice EGI Museum and Memorial in Alabama. And there was a scene that she was watching, and it was of a slave that was bound in chains. And he was telling his story. And my daughter, I think she was 5 at the time, she said, "Daddy, why is he in chains?" And I tell her a little bit of just the history of slavery, and we kind of processed that time. And then a few weeks ago, we were reading through Harriet Tubman's, it's a kid's book on her prayers as she was leading people to freedom. And my daughter asked me, she says, "Daddy, will we ever be slaves again?" And I said, "Honey, the only slavery you can be in is the slave that you put yourself in. If you want to be free, that is a choice." And we talked about the freedom that comes when, I said, Christ came to make us free. There is bondage that we are in our minds, psychologically, sometimes physically. Christ came to set us free in every single capacity. And when I think about freedom today, in some ways, it's a constant journey to freedom, because the more that we allow God to penetrate our minds and hearts, the more that we realize that we are captive to certain things that we didn't know before. And as God does his penetrating work in our hearts, it's like, man, I was a slave to this. I've been a slave to that. And so freedom is this constant state of allowing God to free us from ourselves, to free us from sin, and then to be free to actually live a life worthy. So I am free to love my wife in the right way. I am free to love my daughter wholly, without any sort of baggage that I bring. See, baggage is bondage. And God came to strip us of that bondage. And so when I think of being free, I think about the constant removing of strongholds, baggage, bondage, pain, things that we will always be going through, but God is always plucking them out, plucking them out, plucking them out to allow us to live a life more free each day.
Wow. Personally, I think that's one of the best explanations on freedom that I have ever heard. Especially that freedom is a choice. and that whether we know it or not, we're all slaves, to whatever it is that we give power to. Which segues well into our final God story of the day, where we'll hear about someone who was a slave to unforgiveness.
Our next person is Kathleen Dooley. Now, Kathleen and her husband, Ron, they're giving leadership to Crew's prison ministry. I didn't realize it when I first met Kathleen, but she was on a journey from slavery to freedom that, let's just listen to her.
At a young age, I was sexually abused by my older brother, and all of my growing up years, my mom was a verbal abuser. I grew up being told I was ugly and worthless, she wished I'd never been born, and I had not really ever been taught anything about forgiveness and what that meant. Forgiving those who had hurt us was essential to the health of our Christian life with God. And the main verse is Matthew 6, verse 14. If we will forgive others, God forgives us. But if we don't forgive others, then God doesn't forgive us. And as I studied that passage, I realized what it meant was when we were harboring bitterness and unforgiveness in our hearts, then God can't work in our lives until we settle those issues. I use this illustration when I'm talking with the ladies in prison. Ron had a little electric train set. My husband used to love to play with trains, and he had set up this little train for he and Brian to play in the upstairs room. And so one night, the train wasn't working right, it wouldn't run. And the transformer was on, and everything was right on the train, and yet they'd turn on the transformer and the train wouldn't run. And so Ron remembered he had done some filing on one of the little connections on the train the night before, and he got out his little brush and brushed the track, and this little tiny piece of metal had been sitting on the track, which stopped the power from the transformer getting to the engine of the train. And that's exactly what unforgiveness does in our lives. It blocks the power of God from working in our lives. And so God had really done a transforming work in me. And I reached a point where I knew I needed to forgive my brother and I needed to forgive my mom. Even if they never knew that I had forgiven them, I still needed to do that. And even if they never asked me for forgiveness, I still needed to forgive. We live in a society where everything is instant. And so the moment I realized I needed to forgive, part of that thinking was, I'm not ready to do that. But I finally reached the point of understanding I could forgive even if my emotions weren't there, because God never asks us to do anything that he will not give us the power and the strength to do. So the process for me of forgiving was trusting God that he would get my heart where he needed it to be as long as I was obedient. So I turned it over to him, took it back a couple of times, and turned it over. So we need to be patient with ourselves, and we need to let God do the cleansing in our hearts that needs to be done. And that was the point in time for me where my Christian life really began to become free. That burden that I had carried was gone, and I was walking in freedom.
That train analogy, I'd never heard anything like that, and it's awesome.
Yeah, I love it. You know, when you look at like Victor, here Victor is in a situation where he shouldn't be free.
He's in a jail.
Yeah, but he is free. He's freer than most of the people outside the jail. And then Tyrone talked about the same thing in the sense that you're a slave to whatever you allow to enslave you.
Right, to control you. Whatever you put first.
Exactly. And then Kathleen is someone who wanted to be free, but there was something that was hindering her.
Right,
that shaving, is a great analogy.
Right, just a tiny speck that wasn't letting the train run, and that unforgiveness that she had every right to, but it was still stopping her from a closer relationship with God, obviously with her family, and whatever it was she was meant to do in life. And that's what freedom is. It's allowing you to do what God made you to do. So anyway, that wraps up our first episode. Hopefully it's made you think a little bit about what freedom is, maybe in a little different way.
If you want to dig deeper into the freedom Jesus brings, let me encourage you to check out our show notes. We'll have links there to all kinds of resources for you, articles and websites that can give you some of the answers that you may be looking for.
And the audio you heard today comes from some of our more than 400 and growing videos that we have on crewlegacy.com. That's CRU legacy.com. We also have a YouTube channel, Legacy CCC, and a Crew Legacy Facebook page if you want to subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you like today's podcast, we ask that you please subscribe so you can get the next one and the next one and the next one.
78.4 is a podcast of Legacy, which is a project of Crew.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week. And while we're away, we'd like to encourage you to remember whatever God did in the people you heard speak today, He can do in you. So until next week, go out there and continue the legacy.